Welcome back as we continue covering Chicago white gangs, history, and evolution. You also had the Insane Deuces, who were spawned out of the Morgan Street Deuces and date all the way back to 1959 when they were founded between 16th and 18th in Morgan in the Pilsen district. In 1970, it is said that Little Rich of Morgan Deuces moved from Pilsen to the Lathrop Public Housing Project located in the North Center neighborhood. Little Rich met up with a group of mixed race kids, whites, blacks, and Latinos, who were impressed with his Pilsen war stories. It was there in the projects where Little Rich met up with members of the Junior Barons. So by 1971, the Insane Deuces were expanding all around the North Center neighborhood, mainly around Bricktown and Roscoe Village. By the early 1970s, the Insane Deuces had three different factions and made alliance with the Latin Kings, who were strong in the projects area in the mid-1970s. The Deuces needed a powerful ally because they were fighting with the much larger Simon City Royals. The Deuces also rumbled with the Gaylords. The Deuces first got major exposure when on July 10th, 1974, two of their members gunned down Simon City Royals gang leader Rashad Arab Zayed on Melrose Avenue. The Deuces then grabbed his boy and took it to the corner of Melrose and Damon and dumped the body out in front of Manjovin's restaurant, located on North Damon Avenue. This murder made the papers and gave the Deuces much more recognition than they had previously. In 1976, the Insane Deuces moved out to the suburbs and into Aurora, Illinois, where they also aligned with Latin Kings. By the late 1970s, the only real allies the Deuces had were the Latin Kings. But the Latin Kings were a big part of the People Nation, while the Deuces were not. And this sometimes created issues behind jail and prison walls. In 1980, the Deuces and Gaylords created an alliance behind bars because they were both outnumbered. They got together in 1980 and asked the Latin Kings to sponsor them to join the People Alliance. And in 1981, this was made official. But starting in 1987, the Kings and the Deuces were starting to have arguments over drug turf and other issues. The Kings also started to recruit and flip several of the Deuces, which made older Deuces angry. By 1989, tensions were building up more and more between the Deuces and the Kings. The Vice Lords tried to smooth things over in Aurora, but eventually the Deuces accused the Vice Lords of being more on the Latin King side. In 1989, Lord Gino, who was the Corona of the Latin Kings at the time, moved his girlfriend Bambi, also known as Lady Q, into the Aurora to get her out of Chicago and to have her help run some of his drug operations. This was connected to Little Man, who was a major drug dealer for the Insane Deuces. But evidently, these business transactions were not enough, and the Deuces still claimed that the Kings were overstepping their authority. It is said that in 1989, Lady Q lured Little Man to the Lathrop projects for a cocaine deal when Little Man was taken by surprise and the Kings robbed him of a lot of dope and shot him up. Despite them trying to kill him, Little Man survived, and this was the final straw. Allegedly, the Insane Deuces were so angered by this betrayal and setup that they kidnapped Lady Q and her daughter in exchange for money. It is said that the Latin Kings then hunted down even more Deuces in Aurora and shot them, even though nobody was killed. Now, I'm not sure about this Lady Q story. All I've heard is rumor. According to retired Chicago PD Detective Joe Sparks, this incident is partly true, but we'll save the details on Lord Gino and Lady Q and the Insane Deuces for a later date. The war between the Insane Deuces and Latin Kings was in full swing in the 1990s, in Aurora as well as in Chicago. And this extended even to prison, even though both were part of the People Nation. By 1992, both the Vice Lords and Latin Kings were coming down hard on the Deuces, who basically had no allies. This pretty much forced the Deuces' hand, so they went to the Spanish Cobras and asked them to join the Folks Nation, as well as become part of the Insane family, which the Spanish Cobras were the biggest part of. This occurred in 1992. But it really didn't matter because by 1992, Folks and People alliances were really no longer respected on the street. Peoples were attacking peoples, and Folks were attacking Folks. In 1996, the Deuces went to war with the Maniac Latin Disciples, who were arch enemies of the Spanish Cobras by then. The Deuces operate in Chicago as well as Aurora, and there's a few in Elgin, Roscoe Village, Portage Park, and Canaryville, I've been told. Please let me know if they're active anywhere else. I'd like to hear the current status of them and all the other gangs I mentioned in this video. In 2003, there was a major bust by Aurora PD on members of both the Deuces and Latin Kings. It is said that 65 lives were claimed in the war between the two sides between 1990 and 2003. The same popes first made the newspapers in 1954 when they battled the Douglas Park Dukes. It is said that the popes began in 1949 outside the school grounds of Nathaniel Pope Elementary School, which makes them one of the oldest still active street gangs in Chicago. By the mid 1950s, white residents in the North Lawndale area were moving out into the suburbs, as black gangs like the Clovers, Chaplains, Continental Pimps, Roman Cobras, and Egyptian Cobras were becoming very strong gangs in the area. Finally, the popes could no longer hold down North Lawndale, mostly because Egyptian Cobras, which ran under a leader named Henry Mickey Cogwell in 1966. I'll talk more about that when I get to the Black Chicago Gangs video. You also had the vice lords in that area, which made it practically impossible for the popes or any other white gang to survive. So, in the late 1950s, the popes moved to the Brand Park area near Elton and Melrose Avenue in the Avondale area, in the Avondale neighborhood. And it said they lasted until the late 1960s. In order to survive, the black gangs, as well as Latino gangs, the popes aligned with the Simon City Royals. And even though Simon City nor the popes were part of the United Five organization, they had no real problems with it because they were also predominantly white at that time. But by 1973, the Gaylords started spray painting over Pope tags, and so the popes protested. And this started a war between both gangs. This also forced the popes to align with Simon City Royals. In 1974, the popes moved into new territory in the Logan Square neighborhood when they opened up a section known as Troy Street Popes. But this section only lasted a couple of years. They also opened up a section in Logan Square at Diversity and Mozart. These were called the Polish Popes, but they only lasted a couple of years as well. By 1975, the alliance with Simon City Royals were so strong that some of them began to call themselves the Royal Pope Nation. By 1980, a new Pope leader called Alpo emerged, and he took charge over all Pope sections in the Windy City. He tried to get rid of the white power organization stance of the group, but the Northwest area popes resisted. Because of this division and other gangs encroaching on their territories, by the mid-1980s, the popes faced extinction if they did not take in members of other races. This was very common with most other all-white gangs in the latter part of the 1980s and 1990s, as many began to take in Latinos, and like I said, in the case of Simon City Royals, some blacks and Latinos. By 1990, Alpo was no longer running the popes, and that's when Little Fox took over leadership. But he only ran it for a few years due to heroin addiction. This is when Raymond Mr. Insanity Reyes took over leadership. And as you can tell by last name, he was Latino. There was also a southern faction of popes, but contrary to one might think, they did not branch out from the north side popes. No, the south side popes had different roots. In 1968, they started off as a greaser gang called the LA Boys. This didn't stand for Los Angeles. This stood for the streets that they hung around: La Crosse, La Mon, La Porte, La Verne, Lawyer. But by 1972, the LA Boys died out, and a new group rose up in the area called the Royal Insane Popes in the summer of 1973. And an individual named John Dayton was a part of that handover, since he was part of the LA Boys, who basically passed the baton to the new generation of white youth in the area. But the biggest creator of the Royal Insane Popes was not Dayton. It was Donnie Buffalo Tennant, who was not only the founder, but was the leader of the Southside Popes for many years. By 1974, the Popes had about 20 members, then doubled in size by the next year, and kept on growing into the latter part of the 1970s. From their very start, the Popes united with the 18th and Loomis Latin counts, and also were okay with the Latin Kings, both part of the People Nation. And by 1997, they clashed with the 2-6 from the Little Village, who were part of the Folks Alliance. In the 1970s, the Popes had a big reputation for selling PCP, which is angel dust, sherm. They call it getting wet. And basically what they would do is dip cigarettes or marijuana into PCP solution, or sometimes sprinkle it, and then it was smoked. PCP is used as an animal tranquilizer. So whereas it will put an animal down, for some reason, humans often stay awake, but they're in a zombie-like state. I've heard some cops say that The guy was on PCP. He had superhuman strength. It took 4 or 5 cops to hold this little guy down who was shermed out. But it's not so much that they have super strength, they feel no pain. Regardless, they're still dangerous. PCP also had a really bad reputation because it can do a lot of damage to the brain. And sometimes people smoke it, take a trip, and never come back. In 1981, the popes decided to leave the People Nation, but they also refused to link up with the folks. They did, however, become part of the Almighty family. So at that point, they became Almighty and Sane popes. By 1992, Lord Conan, who was very buffed, as you can see in this picture, stepped down as leader of the popes. But he was still around for about 10 more years, as he's still associated with the group. He just didn't run it. Part of the reason Conan managed to step down is by the early 1990s, there was a lot of feuding within the popes as far as what direction they would move. One faction wanted to remain a white power organization. The others, seeing the future, did not want a whites only popes organization and wanted to take in more minorities. So basically there was a split, almighty popes and insane popes. By 2002, Mike Conan Hamilton completely retired from the gang and moved to Texas. I would like to know more about the current status of the popes, both North and South Side factions, so please comment if you have anything in that regard. I will end this video with a little bit about the Diamond City Royals' history. They began in 1956 when a group of teenage greasers in the West Humboldt Park area got together and started a club near Elmira Simons Park, which is where the name Simon City comes from. At that time, it was very much still an Italian neighborhood, but other nationalities were also in the area. They adopted the colors of black and white. They also had a top hat, curved cane, and gloves, which is very similar to the Vice Lord symbol. By 1959, as more and more Puerto Ricans moved in, they started to fight Puerto Rican gangs, and the friction between them only increased in the 1960s. In 1964, a royal named Andy Bydron took over for the second generation royals coming up near the intersection of Cortland and Whipple in the Logan Square area, which became a new stronghold for the royals. As the Simon City faction in Humboldt Park began to decline, as more Puerto Ricans moved in and more whites moved out. By 1972, the white power organizations were aligning with each other, as stated previously, but the royals and popes did not become part of the United Five organization, and the royals beefed real heavily with Insane Deuces, who were at that point still a majority white organization. In fact, many of the royals considered the Deuces to be a bigger enemy than the Latin Kings, especially since the Deuces aligned themselves with Latin Kings. So basically, the royals viewed the Deuces as race traitors. Like many other gangs, the Simon City Royals would absorb pre-existing gangs. One such group was called the Aces. And this occurred around 1973 or 1974. By 1975, the Gaylords and Simon City Royals beef escalated when the Simon City Royals killed a Gaylord leader, execution style. So now the Almighty Insane Popes and Simon City Royals were both considered arch rivals of the Gaylords, Latin Kings, and Insane Deuces. In 1976, the Royals took in some members of the Almighty Insane Popes after the death of the Pope's leader, Larry Larkin Morris, in 1975. The odd thing is the Royals actually function better without an overall leader. Even though the Simon City Royals were enemies with the Latin Kings, they've always been in tight with Insane Unknowns, which was mostly a Hispanic gang. They also sometimes dealt with black gangs. So even though while many considered Simon City Royals a white power organization, they often made deals with both black and Latino gangs. In 1978, a meeting occurred at Statesville, at which the highest ranking members of the most powerful gangs in Chicago, who are not part of the People Nation, decided to become part of the Folks Nation. This was an idea promoted by black gangster disciple leader King Larry Hoover, and Simon City Royals decided to join the organization. The black gangster disciples then would often use Simon City Royals to do special jobs for them, and the Simon City Royals supplied the BGDs with guns, while the BGDs supplied the Royals with dope. By the mid-1990s, the Folks Alliance broke down out on the street and often in prison, after gangs like the Spanish Cobras and Maniac Latin Disciples went at it, as well as other folks gangs that were supposed to be allies. In the early 1990s, it is said that the Simon City Royals shot caller was Frank Fats Fender. He and some of the other Royals decided to link up with Imperial Gangsters and Latin Eagles to create the Almighty Familia. This almighty family was opposed to the insane family of the Spanish Cobras, as well as the maniac family of the Maniac Latin Disciples, even though they're all part of the folk nation. By 1995, Frank Fender stepped down, and it said that Brian Mouse Nelson took over leadership. However, really, Mouse only ran Royal's operation at Statesville prison, and after he's moved to the TAM Supermax, he basically lost his juice, and it said that he went crazy in TAMS. As I stated previously, TAMS was eventually shut down due to lawsuits and court orders deeming it to be cruel and unusual punishment. So with the white greaser gangs, most of whom were white pride organizations, like I said, in order to survive, they had to adapt. And so many gangs, such as the Simon City Royals, let in a lot of Latinos. In fact, Latinos may make up the majority these days in a lot of these gangs. An example was a Simon City Royal member who was convicted of murder and sent to prison as a teen and won a wrongful conviction lawsuit after spending more than a decade behind bars. When released, he was awarded $25 million. Jimenez spent much of that money on fancy cars, guns, and drug-fueled parties for his homeboys. Some say that Simon City was on the verge of collapsing, but Jimenez's infusion of money reinvigorated it, and it was rumored that he paid as much as $50,000 in recruitment payments, as well as paying for members to get gang tattoos on their faces, posting bail for gang members awaiting trial. But then it all came crashing down when he shot a fellow Simon City gang member in both legs, and then took off in his Mercedes that was full of guns and ammunition. A friend who sat in the passenger seat filmed much of the eluding police on iPhone until Jimenez lost control of the car and crashed. Then he still ran from the police, but was eventually caught and returned to prison. A good website on old school white greaser gangs is stonegrease.com. So that's just a little bit of Simon City Royals history for you, as well as other white gangs. I know I didn't get into a lot of details, but due to time, I just can't do it right now. I'll come back to them later. I hope you enjoyed this episode and continue watching. We have one more episode on black gangs, and that'll be the end of my Chicago series for now. Thanks once again to ChicagoGangHistory.com for your well-done research on these gangs. Don't forget to purchase your copy of Chicago-Based Gangs, Beyond Folks and People, written by myself and Joe Sparks, retired Chicago Police Department gang detective. Our book can be purchased on Amazon.com and other platforms, and it can be ordered from any major bookstore. As always, please take care of each other and stay safe. Next time, this is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, and politicians.